Welcome to my autumn garden action plan. I've got a lot to cover, so in this video I'll highlight some of my favourite flowers for late colour, including the perennial sunflower, Helianthus, the brilliant golden Rudbeckia Goldsturm, and the gorgeous duo of dwarf Alstroemeria. There's watering to do, roses to keep deadheaded, autumn pots to plant up to provide colour over the weeks ahead, seeds to collect, lilies to propagate, spring bulbs to plant like daffodils and tulips, and along the way there are plenty more tips and planting suggestions to bring in the bees. In part 2 of this short series I'll be covering my action plan for the kitchen garden, fruits and crops to care for during the autumn. But sit back and relax and enjoy this action plan all about the flower garden. I grow lots of things in pots on my patio, and you want to keep the summer displays going for as long as possible, well into autumn, to keep the things flowering. And things like this lovely Nemesia, I think this is Lady Emma, just keep them watered. Even when it rains, sometimes you need to water your patio pots. Alstroemeria, I've kept well deadheaded. It's got more flushes of blooms coming along. Other things I've got in pots like the bloodgrass imperata and the hostas there. Keep them watered, fill up the little saucers underneath them with water so that they've got plenty of moisture to take up and keep growth strong and healthy. The lovely structural grasses like this striped leafed miscanthus look great in patio pots right through the year, but particularly now in autumn they're at their very tallest, producing a really impressive display. The pineapple flowers, this is Eucomis bicolor, just coming to an end, but the seed heads forming nicely on that. The cordyline Torbay dazzler got killed off last winter, died right the way back to the base, but this new growth coming up, it's really rejuvenated the pot. Hydrangeas at this time of year also can start looking magnificent. The white flowered Madame Emile Moulier looking gorgeous at the moment, shining out in the sunshine today. Another lovely pineapple flower, Eucomis, and keeping the displays going well into autumn. We've got the dahlias. This one is Bishop of York. Lovely single flowers. Hoverfly enjoy feeding on those, eating the pollen and the nectar. And this will keep on flowering, keep deadheading. You'll get further flushes of flower right up to the frost. And then I'll leave this dahlia in its pot for the winter. I'll just stop watering, move the pot to my unheated greenhouse, and let the dahlia die down naturally, and hopefully that will come back again next year to put on another display. The begonias in hanging baskets have looked glorious this summer, but you do need to go on providing them with attention until the frosts finally bring the display to an end. And deadheading is one of those things just to do every few days. Just go over the plants, and if you find any faded blooms, you can just sort of pick those off, just snap those off earlier, further down into the plant itself. Just remove any old petals and things you see, just to keep the display looking its best. You might also see the seed heads developing on them, so these can be picked off too. So just go over the plants, pick off anything that fades, and leave these other flowers to develop. And of course, in addition to deadheading, watering, just baskets will need water. I can usually tell just by lifting the basket at the base, see how heavy it is, but just make sure you give it plenty of water to keep this display going. I won't need to feed because I mix some slow release fertiliser into the compost at planting time, but just give them a really good drench of water every few days. Water will overflow and drip down. I've got a fern down below actually to catch the water, and Once it's had a really good soaking, then I can go on and water the rest of the bedding plants in pots. I'm always looking for flowers in my garden which are hardy and perform really well. And this hardy perennial is a variety of the perennial sunflower family. It's Helianthus. This is called Lemon Queen, that starts flowering through August, well into September, and produces a succession of these beautiful golden daisy shaped flowers. They open flower after flower after flower, giving you weeks of beautiful performance. And it starts flowering, as I say, in around about August time. It will grow in good conditions to about 5, maybe even 6 foot in height. It spreads as a clump to fill your borders. So it's a great plant to put towards the back of the flowering displays in your borders. Or here in my garden, I've got a corner spot. I need a little bit of height and impact. And it grows really, really well. In the winter, it just dies down to ground level, grows up in the spring, puts on a lovely thicket of growth through the summer months, and as we move through August, the first flowers will start to open. And being a lovely single open flower, it brings in the bees. The bees adore feeding from the flowers, so you'll find it's alive through these late summer months into autumn, keeping the bees happy. And it also feeds hoverflies that can feed from their single flowers. The hoverfly adult will be feeding on the pollen and nectar in these blooms, and it will produce, as I say, many, many weeks of superb flowering performance and come back year after year. The Clematis viticella Etoile rose has been flowering for weeks now, produces these lovely little nodding heads of pink flowers with a deeper pink band down the centre of each petal. And as the flowers fade, you'll be left these really charming, sort of fluffy seed heads to enjoy over the coming weeks. And I've just let this clematis scramble up into the holly hedge alongside. Clematis viticella will die back in the winter, and I cut it right off at soil level and I let it grow up through the season, scrambling over holly hedge on one side and this nice lace cap hydrangea on the other. This is looking gorgeous now. The hoverflies still feeding from these flowers, enjoying the nectar and pollen. And if you've got hoverflies feeding on your flowers, you know that they'll be breeding and laying eggs, and the larvae of the hoverfly will be feeding on your greenfly and aphid pests. So certainly worth having these in the garden. Hydrangeas are a lovely flower just to take summer into autumn, and even once the flowers start fading, they've still got a charm of their own. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, Adam's Gardening Guides on YouTube. I've got dozens more videos on my channel which I hope you'll enjoy too, so check those out. Thank you. I'm a great fan of hardy perennials which come up year after year, and one really reliable variety I've planted in the border here just underneath the shade of this Viburnum mauricii is one of my favourites. This is Rudbeckia Goldsturm. Really reliable plant, really doesn't need to be divided that often, probably every 3 or 4 years at the most. And as we move through July into August and certainly into September, you'll be getting the flowers developing, these beautiful golden daisy shaped flowers which last for many, many weeks, puts on a great show and shines out, I think, like a beacon in a slightly dappled shade position, adding a touch of gold to your borders. So if you want something really cheerful to brighten up your September garden, check out the Rudbeckias, and especially this lovely variety, Rudbeckia Goldsturm. And over my pergola arch, dividing the top from the bottom of the garden, I've trained the golden hop, which is now producing some nice little hops. Leaves aren't quite as golden as the new growth is. Goes over on the other side of the arch. Got this lovely golden leafed jasmine, Fiona Sunrise, which loses leaves in the winter and puts on a lovely display of golden foliage through the year. Little white summer jasmine flowers as well. This is mixed in here. We've got some hops being produced here, and also the seed heads of the honeysuckle. I've got a honeysuckle just twining in amongst the other climbers up this arch with the golden jasmine and also a wisteria. And once the flowers of honeysuckle are finished, it produces these lovely berries which will continue just adding some extra colour and interest to this display well into the autumn months. It's nice to boost your patio displays with seasonal bedding plants. I've had the nemesia around the yucca giving me colour through the summer. Now we're moving into autumn. I'm going to plant up some of my pots with some autumn chrysanthemums. I bought some little pots of this one. It's just called chrysanthemum purple, so it doesn't really have a named variety. I'm going to plant them into this container, and these will give you flowers for many more weeks as you move through September into October. Some flowers opening, lots of buds to come, so you'll get probably 7 or 8 weeks of flower colour out of these chrysanthemums. Now I've lined the inside of this terracotta pot with some bits of old compost bag just to stop the pot losing so much moisture. Fill it with a layer. I'm using a peat-free compost today. Put a layer of compost in there. Then what I tend to do is to get each of these plants and get the empty pots and use these as a template for planting up the pot itself. So I just put those down there. Just get your little pots in. Third one here. And now I will fill in around these with compost. Just firming the compost around the empty pots. I'm positioning these so they're just below the rim of the pot. So actually the compost will be a centimetre or 2 below the rim of the terracotta pot. When I finish, I'm just going to go on filling in around this with compost. Push it down firmly because you want it to stay in place when you remove these plastic pots. Then once you've got a decent amount of compost in, firm it down well and just ease each of these pots out to leave the indentation of the pot itself. Then all you've got to do is take your individual plants and root balls, and these will just drop down into the indentations that you've created. Here we go. Last one in there. And now I can just fill in around with a little bit more compost, and finally water in to settle the compost around the root ball of little chrysanthemum plants that we've put in. Just water from above and let the water trickle down. And then what I do through the summer, and I will do this through the autumn as well, particularly with things in terracotta pots, is I will leave a saucer underneath the pot filled with water. So on hot days there's a reservoir of moisture in the base. I think for plants like this I'd probably leave the saucer there until the end of the year, but if you find that the rainy weather is coming, you could remove the saucer. But to be honest, the reservoir's only got a couple of centimetres of water in, so the compost isn't going to get waterlogged. That just provides that extra reservoir of moisture to keep growth going and keep the plants happy while they're in flower. I love my duo of Alstroemeria. I've got 2 dwarf varieties in small pots. These are varieties of Alstroemeria indicantia, and I started a few years ago with this lovely pink variety called Sunshine, which the bees adore feeding from too. And last year I got a companion for it. This is Alstroemeria Havana. Both very dwarf compact varieties, and as you can see, if I step back a little bit here, they're in small pots, about 10-12 inch pots, and they only grow to about 10 or 12 inches in height themselves. And talk about long-lasting flower power. These are superb varieties. They are hardy. I leave them in pots all year round. They can be divided and repotted probably every other year. The new growth comes up in the spring. I actually put these pots in my greenhouse to give them some protection from winter wet, but they don't need warmth over winter. And the new growth starts in the spring, and I bring the pots outside and put them on the patio probably around about June time, and I'll get a succession of flowers through June, July, August, September, now into September, and these should go on producing more flushes of flower well into the autumn. I'd certainly expect to be enjoying some flowers later in October and even November. And Alstroemerias are very easy to look after. The new flower stems grow up from the base. When flowers have finished, as they have here, this flower spike has finished flowering, you literally grasp the stem at the base and give it a tug. It's a firm tug. There, up it comes, and you just pull the whole thing away from the base. And where that's broken away from the base, you'll actually get some new flower spikes developing. Over here on this pot of sunshine, again, I've got a couple of flower spikes have finished, so literally grab the spike and give it a whoop, just pulled away, just pull it away right from the base, pull it away, pull it up completely, sharp tug, pull it up, and that's the best way. Don't cut them off, or the base of that stem can rot in the soil. Just give them a little bit of a tug, and then you'll be getting new flushes of flowers developing over the coming weeks. Regularly deadheading roses encourages further flushes of flowers to develop as we move through the year. So just clip over these to remove any faded flowers, keeps the displays looking tidy. And deadheading, as I say, is a really good way of making sure that new shoots will be developed from further down the stem to carry flushes of flowers right the way through into autumn. Whenever you've got a faded flower stem like this, follow it down to a pair of leaves lower down, snip away just any faded flowers, follow the stem back, prune just above the leaf, keep the plants looking neat and tidy, and hopefully you'll encourage further flushes of flower later in the year. I do try and plant flowers in my garden to give me blooms right the way through the year, particularly for feeding the bees. The sedum varieties are coming into flower as we move through late summer into autumn, and the bees really adore feeding on those. So when you're planning your garden flowers and planting, nice to have the foliage and the structure, but also try and have something in flower for as many months of the year as possible, particularly with bees in mind. Now September, October, even into November, good times for planting daffodils, and later in the year tulips as well. And I fill deep pots with a good multi-purpose compost. Fill them about good half, 2/3 full, and then spread the bulbs out over the surface of the compost. Be generous, plant plenty in a pot, so bigger pots, more compost, more bulbs. Space the bulbs out, so they're not actually touching, but a good layer of bulbs. Cover with more compost, water well, put the pots somewhere sheltered to develop over the winter time. Somewhere I put mine at the back of the arch, and then by March, April time, the bulbs will come into full flower. You can enjoy a wonderful spring flowering display. Lilies have been a real favourite of mine on the summer patio. And now we're moving into autumn, you'll notice that on some varieties, the top of the stems, you'll get these little bulbs starting to form around the leaves, tiny little nodules, and these can be propagated and grown on to form new lily bulbs. They'll take several years to grow up to flowering size. If you just look at the tops of the stems of this variety of Lineum leichtlinii, there's the leaf stalk, and in just the node in between the leaf and the stem are these tiny little dark, almost black bulbils. Sometimes they'll fall off onto the ground on their own, but really if you can pick these off, just tease them off once they're about the size of a pea, pick them off, and you can pot these up individually either into seed trays or little modules, grow them on, they will root, you can grow them on over the next few years and they'll reach fully sized lily bulbs to give you more flowers. Before I describe some of the plant combination recipes I've developed in my patio pots over the last few years, there's just one more group of flowering plants I must mention, and that's pansies and violas. These bedding plants are great value when you're gardening on a budget, and they have a wonderful repeat flowering habit, producing new flowers continually through autumn, winter and into spring. They come in such a wide range of colours and mixtures, there's certain to be one that takes your fancy, and their happy little faces are certain to bring a smile to your face during winter too. To keep pansies and violas blooming, just snip off the faded flowers, as they have a habit of forming little seed heads, which you don't want. Keep pots watered when conditions are dry, which they often can be through the winter and spring. And be on the lookout for green fly pests, especially on the underside of leaves, treating the plants with an organic spray if necessary. For one of my autumn winter pot arrangements, I've chosen a cheery yellow viola that will shine out on dull days. To get started, I've chosen a large patio pot. This will hold a greater variety and number of plants in a small pot to create a much more impressive display. My pot is made of terracotta, which is porous. It's a breathable material, so to keep the compost moister for longer, I line the inside with pieces of plastic cut from old compost bags. Then I fill with a good quality multi-purpose compost, and prefer using a peat-free compost if I can find one, to which I add some slow release fertiliser granules mixed well into the compost. Now for the plants. First things first, water everything well before planting. To add height with its beautifully variegated foliage, I'm a great fan of a spurge called Euphorbia Ascot Rainbow, which has a greyish green leaf with an irregular golden edge. And these take on a pink tinge during cold winter weather. It's the leaves that add interest through the winter, but heads of flower develop at the tips of each stem through spring into early summer. For my second plant, I've chosen an evergreen shrub called Skimmia. You'll find lots of suitable varieties for growing in pots, and I'll cover some of these later, but I like Skimmia rubella. This is a male form with deep green leaves and flowers at the tips of each shoot that have a deep pink bud through the winter time. For some colourful berries, I've chosen Panettia mucronata, the prickly heath. You'll sometimes find this sold as Gaultheria mucronata, which is exactly the same thing. Check the surface of the pot for weeds, moss or other unwanted growth and pick this off before planting. Bittercress is one weed you'll often find on new plant purchases, so pick it off rather than allow it to develop and spread around your garden. If it has some really good clusters of berries, then place these close to the edge of the pot so that they just hang over the side. As before, I fill in around the root ball of the shrub with a little compost as I plant, pushing it down firmly with my fingertips to remove any air pockets and adjusting its position and level. And for the finishing touch, I recommend violas, repeat flowering bedding plants that bloom successionally until spring. Plant generously to fill in around the shrubs and completely cover the compost. Bright yellow violas look really cheerful during the cold, dull days of winter, and they match the golden stripe in the leaf of Euphorbia Ascot Rainbow, as well as contrasting nicely with the pink berries of the Panettia and the lovely red blooms of Skimmia rubella. Just water well after planting to settle the compost in around the root balls of the shrubs and bedding. Then check weekly to ensure the compost remains moist and doesn't dry out completely. Back to Skimmia for a moment. The Skimmia rubella I planted in this arrangement is a male form of Skimmia, and you'll find some Skimmia are male, some are female, and some are both. Skimmia Q Green is another popular male form with glossy green evergreen leaves and large green flower heads through winter that open into white flowers in late spring. These flowers are sometimes called terminal panicles, which describes their form. Skimmia Finchii has white flowers and plain green leaves, but for variegated foliage, look for the much dwarfer Skimmia Magic Marlowe, with a creamy edge to its leaves and red winter flower buds bursting open into fragrant white flowers in spring. Or there is a slightly more vigorous variegated form called Skimmia porosa. If you've got any camellias in your garden, remember to keep up the watering through autumn. Really give them a good soak to make sure they never go short of water, particularly any camellias growing in pots. The thing is, at this time of year, the camellia is starting to form its flowers. Little flower buds are developing at the tips of all the shoots. And if the camellia goes short of moisture during the autumn months, August through September, October, November, if you go short of moisture, then the buds don't develop properly and they can fall off before the flowers fully open next spring. So make sure you keep camellias really well watered, particularly when the weather is dry. I just had some calendulas which I've sown here. Bees enjoying feeding on these today. I've just sown this little row of calendulas alongside my lettuces and salads and other crops here, but the bees really love feeding on the flowers. The hoverflies will come in too. That companion planting is a great way of controlling pests around the garden. But if you've got some flowers in here, then you're going to be getting the bees and the beneficial insects coming in. So always try and find space to put a few flowers in amongst the crops. The companion planted calendulas or pot marigolds around the kitchen garden provide some lovely flowers for the beneficial insects to come in, but I let them seed as well. You can deadhead regularly, picking off these deadheads to stop them forming seeds and keep the flowers going, but it's certainly worth leaving some to set seed later in the season, because I can collect these seeds and sow some new marigolds next year from the seeds that I've sown. Thanks for joining me in my garden. Hopefully it's just shown you what I've been up to and given you a few ideas for your own gardens, perhaps some things to put into action next year and keep the colour going right the way through into autumn in your own garden. Whatever you're up to, happy gardening.